Welcome to Living from the Soul. This is Sam Terode, and today I'm here with Nathan Landis Funk. He's a singer-songwriter who's just released his debut album called Here's to the Sojourners. So Nathan, how does it feel to have this project done and out into the world?
I am relieved. This project snowballed from what it originally was going to be. It started as basically a random sentence at the end of a video that I put out in January about a book project I was working on. It was kind of like, oh yeah, I didn't even mention that I'm going to come out with an album also. And thinking that I was going to have like a book done and an album done by like June of this year, and we've only just released the album, and the book is a very long way away from publishing. So first of all, it feels relieving. I feel like I can almost take a break for like the rest of my life in a way and just kind of have fun, because I feel like I said all the big important things I wanted to say. So now I
Nice.
can just
Yeah,
coast and enjoy it.
nice. And I've read your book or a draft of it.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
It seems to me that it's about ready to put out. So
I mean, it is I guess, seventh draft of it has been written. So, I mean, there's certainly a form of it that would be fairly simple to put out, although I don't want to say simple because I was actually just talking to a former guest of yours on the podcast, Ryan Rhodes, about saying, oh, I'll just do this, using the word just, because anytime you just do something, tack on like an extra 6 months to whatever you're just going to do, because it's very likely it's going to snowball from there. But the book is in a much more completed form than it was a year ago. So a form of it could be published very soon if I really wanted it to.
nice. And your concept was from the beginning was to have the album Here's to the Sojourners and the book, which I think was called Glorious Shipwreck.
Yeah.
Those two fit together.
Yeah, essentially the idea was a musical audiobook about navigating a crisis of faith.
Mhm.
And so during the pandemic, I basically started working on this project. Not that I had any plans to make a book out of it, but it was really just for my own benefit that I started doing some research and looking at my life over the past 10 years. And it just sort of turned into this musical audiobook concept. But for right now, I'm just happy that the music got out.
Yeah, and I hope you do combine the two here eventually, maybe next year.
Yeah, I do think that like more is going to happen with it, because I was a theater major in college, and a lot of my career is shaped around storytelling. Singer-songwriting is actually a newer iteration of what I'm doing as a career. So the songs I tend to write are very situational, and sometimes are best with a lot of context and a story around it. Especially the nature of this album, because I didn't actually write really any of the songs of the album with the intention to put them out on an album. They were songs I wrote to process various things I've been experiencing over the past 10 years. So one of the songs of the album, Come Here Child, which has proven to be one of the most popular ones so far, I actually started writing in 2013. So they've been sort of sitting on the cooker for a while, which I guess has been good.
That's actually my favorite song on the
Oh,
album.
yay.
Was going to bring that up later. So yeah, it's a duet. So and you have a great duet partner on that.
Yeah, she's awesome. It's so funny. Some of the feedback I've gotten so far from strangers, because I use a program called Submit Hub, where basically people can give you random feedback not knowing who you are. And this one guy was like, yeah, I really like the woman's voice. She's a lot better than the male voice. Yeah, so definitely like I'm like, oh, I know. Oh, I know. So yeah, shout out to Sue Ellen, because she's an amazing singer, and I need to do a post that's specifically about her, because she actually does have some original music out herself, but it's sitting on her SoundCloud, and it's only got like, I don't know, some of these songs only have like 30 people who've listened to it, and I'm like, these songs are really good. So I really should just do a whole pitch about her project, because I'm very excited about her stuff too.
Yeah, lyrically, I like that song a lot too. And that one definitely seems to be from your perspective, where some of the other songs, it seems you're maybe portraying a character who's not yourself.
Yeah, Come Here Child, I kind of wanted to leave that open to interpretation, because one of the major themes of the album is essentially having to do with figuring out what you believe and what your faith is and things like that. And so I didn't want to sort of dictate to people like, well, here's what you should think or believe. And that's why, in a way, music really works well for that medium, because it allows the listener to kind of think what they will. But certainly the background to that song is a little unique in the sense that when I started writing that song in 2013, it was called Not by Might, and the chorus was completely different. And so it was just a solo piece that I sang the whole way through. Um, there's a practical reason why I changed the chorus, and that is that it was written in a completely different tempo than the verses for no reason other than I just didn't really think it through. And then the other reason was that that song initially had a much more kind of religious aspect to it, that I kind of wanted to see if I could just condense it into something that could be applicable to anyone who is just having a bad day or a bad couple of days or weeks or months. And for me, that song was a song I started writing once I started feeling like my life was really not turning out the way I had mapped out so perfectly in my late teens, early 20s. This grand plan to take over the world, when I started wondering like, okay, something's gone wrong here. And so I needed to find a way to kind of be okay and learn to accept that. And so Come Here Child ended up being the result of that, essentially.
So it sounds like your beliefs or your faith changed even over the course of writing that one song.
Yeah, actually, at some point maybe I'll do a post about kind of before or after, because certainly a song that is that old, I guess, in my catalog, I started writing that kind of at the beginning of my own, like, I guess different people call it different things, like faith transition, deconstruction, a crisis of faith, whatever you want to call it. Like that was kind of at the very beginning of it, where I was sort of starting to transform, starting to ask questions. And so that was certainly reflected in how that song ended up turning out.
Yeah, I was thinking of the overall theme of the album, and would you say it's more about a leaving or losing faith or a transformation of faith?
That's a great question, because I find that a lot of people in what I guess would be called the deconstruction community focus on that deconstruction, on what they are losing. I mean, it's inherent in the title of deconstruction when you start to doubt like what you were raised with or what you believed, or when your perfectly held together beliefs sort of meet something that causes a cognitive dissonance, which is a term that I didn't know before, but it helped explain a lot of what I went through when I went to college, and a lot of people went to college to experience. But for me, I guess part of the purpose of the album was to, instead of focusing so much on the negative and so much on like, we've lost all this, I mean, that's an important part of the process. But if all we're going to do is just be sad about what we lost, like, what's even the point? Like, if there's no hope beyond that or nothing to it, like, why even talk about it? Why not focus on something else? Why not just, I don't know, not think into it? And so this album, I mean, I guess if I'm going to dive into what it came from, and I can share as much or as little as might be interesting to your audience, but 10, 11 years ago, I went to I guess you would call it we nickname it Christian Hogwarts. It's basically this like Bible school in California that's very into supernatural ministry, as they call it, or like some people would think of it as like faith healing. And anyway, I became curious during the pandemic about what happened to my friends, a lot of them that I met during that time, and sort of the plans we had. And I interviewed probably 19 people from that time during the pandemic to just find out what their stories were. And I found out like so many of them had hit a brick wall at some point. They came up against whether it was praying for someone who was sick that they believed was going to get well, like healed of cancer or something like that, because that's a big tenet of that supernatural ministry, is like doing what Jesus did. Like if you pray and believe, then like the sick person's going to get well. You can even like raise people from the dead, like casting out demons, all this sort of stuff. And so enough people like had encountered experiences where that didn't happen, that didn't turn out, that it just, long story short, it just caused this huge interrupt and just like a crash and burn, really, for most people. And I started thinking like, well, who's there for those people when they crash and burn? Because when you're going through your questions and doubt, I mean, it can be really paralyzing when you think everybody else out there, is doing fine. You're the only one who's asking questions. You're the only one sitting in a church service wondering like if everything around you is totally made up and you're all just being manipulated. And when you have this sort of threat of either socially being cast out or going to hell, like it's really, really hard to talk to somebody about it or even admit it to yourself. And so I wanted to create an album for anyone who is going through that, to sort of help them through that. And I guess to circle back to your question, like, because I've been through that myself and found that actually there is something that you can look forward to through all that, even if it's just learning to be honest with yourself about what you're thinking and not shoving things under the rug, whatever that may be, whether they're doubts or whether, you have questions, or like that in and of itself is freeing. And you might not have all the answers. And you might never have all the answers. Like, in fact, let's face it, you're not ever going to have all the answers. But one thing that brought me a lot of clarity was an interview I did with a guy named Phil Drysdale, who runs a pretty actually popular Instagram channel and website and things like that. But he was a friend of mine from this school I went to earlier, and he went through a similar process. But he told me, like, all the people who've been through this process, like, they think they're looking for answers. They think they're looking for, okay, well, a perfectly constructed new set of beliefs. But he said what people are actually looking for is a home. They're just looking for a place where they can share who they are and what they think, like warts and all, and have that be accepted fully. And so with this album, I wanted to hopefully create it in a sense, like a musical home for people who might be in that spot that I was in, in the mid 2010s, asking all these questions and feeling very alone. And so that in itself, I think, sort of encapsulates that it's not just about the leaving, but it's also coming into a new home that's more whole and connected to who you really are.
You mentioned being honest with yourself, so that's a nice transition to your song titled Honesty. And in my interpretation, it seems to be about a music minister who is getting up there, going through the motions every Sunday and not really believing what he's singing. Now, is that about a character you created, or is that an autobiographical song in some way?
It's definitely a composite. Actually, Phil Drysdale is one of the inspirations for that. So the second verse is a combination of Phil Drysdale and another. I can't remember if I can name names with him, but another guy who essentially had the same story as Phil, where they were doing these preaching tours and they were saying all these things, but they found like a growing disconnect to what they were actually saying, and they were just kind of pacing the stage, going through the motions, but really inherently sort of having doubts about everything they were saying. It's a difficult place to be in. And then I guess my connection to it comes into play more so after the first chorus, going into the third verse and the bridge, talking about like bleeding into your diary and burying all the evidence, afraid it won't make any sense. Because I mean, I spent years sort of percolating and asking myself these questions about like, what do I think? What do I believe? And really didn't talk to anybody about it. And there was this moment in late 2014 that I call my reckoning day, where it was like the day after Christmas, because I was like, all right, if what I'm about to do is going to make my life fall apart, at least it won't ruin the Christmas spirit. So December 26th, 2014, I basically like sat on a couch and wrote down like every doubt and question I had about my faith and what I was pursuing. And it wasn't like I was doing that with an agenda to try to come to an answer. I mean, that was a scary thing. It was like the first time I hadn't asked a question without already having an answer prepared. But what I found when I wrote out all of those things, I mean, like things like maybe yoga isn't bad. It was like all of these things that like for me, who was like small town kid from Saskatchewan, Canada, had like a Mennonite upbringing, and then, went to this charismatic Bible school. Like definitely going to Temple Theaters in Philadelphia to get a theater degree was very, very jarring. Totally, totally different world. So anyway, it was like trying to put those worlds together in some way that made some sense. So I made a list of all the things that I was trying to put together. I was like, is church, essentially just like theater, but in like another form? Like, can I actually have a conversation with God, or is God like a character in a novel that I'm writing? Because I literally, when I started writing plays, I realized like my characters would talk back to me, and I'm like, this is very similar to like how I was taught to understand the voice of God, but this is just like this random guy named Benjamin that I made up. And so it was all of these things that were really, really, really scary. But once it drove me insane enough, I figured, all right, I'm just going to admit them. And what I found in that reckoning day was, even though I had written out all these things, I realized, number one, I did not have any answers to any of these questions. Number two, everything I'd written down was completely like truthful. And there was no argument my mind could come up against those things. I was like, yeah, this is all obvious. But number three, the craziest thing, the thing I didn't expect, was I suddenly had peace, like the same kind of peace that I would have experienced in a church service. It was just this sense that, you know what, it's going to be okay. You are putting yourself back together. And at the time I was like, well, is that God? Is it me? I don't know what it is. But I've found in some of the interviews I've had with other friends who've gone through similar experiences, they also have that sort of peace. It's like this part where you're kind of learning to become whole again, or make your beliefs all, I don't know, all friends again. You all have like a place at the table. And so that's why I put some of those verses in, especially the end of the bridge. The roots are sometimes bitter, but the fruit that grows sweet, and the truth might not be pretty, but always sets you free. I mean, and that's a verse from the Bible, that last part. And I think that's especially pertinent when those truths can carry through.
I like this exercise you did of writing down all your doubts. It reminds me, in college, I decided to face doubt head on by reading through the Gospels and writing down any parts that bothered me or I had questions about. Things like the two different genealogies for Jesus
Oh
in two of
yeah.
the Gospels, and then predictions like Jesus saying that some in this crowd will not die before I come again.
Right. And you're like, wait, did that happen?
So those were some major questions, but then I would say I more just stuffed those and
Yeah.
covered them up by reading a lot of intellectual Christian books of heavy theology, especially from Catholic and Orthodox writers. You can spend a lifetime if you say, well, first I've got to read through all the church fathers and see what they have to say.
Yes.
You can get sucked into a multi-year project that way, which is what happened to me.
Yeah, you can. And for me, it was a little different because I had pursued the more experiential side of God. I mean, like the only Bible school experience I had was literally like a school of supernatural ministry, where you're taught to like go out and like your evangelism was to like lay hands on sick people and have them get better. So
do you fail the class? If they don't get better, do you fail the class?
I don't, that's a funny question, but I'm gonna say no, because not everyone gets better, as we learned.
A for effort.
But yeah, A for effort. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, like the book I wrote, it definitely dives into some of that stuff, and so it's just some of the stuff is so like personal and involves like other people in my life that's part of the reason too that I'm not so sure about publishing it like in its form. I mean, if I were able to like fictionalize it or part of it, I would feel better about it. But then the problem with that is, especially when you're dealing with like a faith journey, like the part that makes it most important is the fact that these things did happen. You're not like playing God as the narrator and just saying, well, this is what has happened. So that's something I struggle with. But one thing I am toying with, and I've had this as an idea for a long time anyway, is essentially taking these songs and making a staged concert version of them that interweaves the stories with the music. And so it would be like an actual live musical audiobook in a way. That might be a way for me to play test the concepts and see what resonates with audiences and what people most want to hear. And, so it might be a little less sort of painful than putting all this effort into like publishing a book that's sort of set in stone. When in some ways, like the audience for this is still being defined. Because another thing that I've appreciated about this process so far is I've actually gotten a lot of really good feedback from people who believe like very different things. Like I have had really kind words said from like very conservative Christians, from people who are atheists, from people who like, in a lot of ways would probably be very opposed on some, a political ideology and whatnot. But again, like I guess that's part of the other reason why I felt like this project might be worth pursuing, because especially if you look at polarization in the United States and around the world, which I think in part is due to social media. If you've watched the documentary The Social Dilemma that came out the other year, I think that encapsulates that really well. It's like this sort of like disconnect between people groups is getting really, really serious and really scary. And so for me, I guess maybe it's like in my Canadian Mennonite like pacifistic nature to want to be like a mediator and kind of be like, well, where can we like talk together and like resolve our differences?
Yeah.
So that's part of it too, is just figuring out like, okay, what is the audience for this music?
Having read your book draft, I thought it was excellent and there was nothing inflammatory or offensive. You could
Thank
just
you.
change whatever names you need to change and put it
That's
out
true.
there.
I'll just change some names, call it a day. That's true. I think it probably could be done. It's just like any creative project, as you know, it's just so taxing that like after the album came out, I just was like, oh my gosh, I never want to like do a thing ever again. I just want to like sit and enjoy life, which obviously that's not going to last. But right now I'm still on that sort of like honeymoon phase where I'm trying to recover.
Yeah. You produced and recorded your album yourself, right?
So the EP I came out with in 2018, I essentially recorded entirely myself. But the album I came out with this year, I guess I would give myself like the producer role, but I recorded it with, I hired a mixing engineer, Nick Fiorentino, who's a great engineer, works in Philly at Minor Street Studios, which is really great, really great studio there. And so we basically hodgepodged our way into like recording however we could. So we recorded drums and bass and some live piano at Minor Street. But we recorded some songs at a studio, which actually is in a farm in Chester County. So it's like this wooden cabin. So we recorded, I don't know, maybe 30 to 40% of the stuff there. I did all my own background vocals there. And incidentally, anyone who is familiar with the album, Tales of the Phantom Ship, you might notice there's like rain in the beginning and thunder. And if you listen real close, you can actually hear a cow mooing, which we thought sounded kind of like a foghorn. So we decided to keep it in there. But that was all recorded at the farm there. And it happened to be actually like storming that night really hard. But then we recorded some of the other like lead vocals and guitar over at Nick's home studio. So it was really just a hodgepodge. We had remote musicians. My cellist, Jillian Blythe, she recorded from New York. I had a couple other singers from New York. I had Katie Grennan, who's like this incredibly talented, amazing fiddle player. She actually fiddles for Gaelic Storm. So she recorded in Chicago. And then we had my friend Chris from Canada, who's been my friend since I was 5 years old. He actually recorded the blacksmith sounds you hear in Foot from Gold in a forge in Cochrane, Alberta.
Wow.
So it was a production that sort of went all around the United States and Canada.
Which instruments did you play on?
I did all the piano. I did about 60% of the guitar. I did mandolin, which showed up on Come Here Child and Go Along Your Way. And that was actually the last thing I recorded for the album. It was the mandolin on Come Here Child. And obviously lead vocals, background vocals. There's an instrument called the bodhrán that I played on Tales of the Phantom Ship. It's like an Irish drum. So if you listen to that beat in the back, there's like a stomp pedal, and then there's also a bodhrán. So I think that about rounds it out on the album.
Wow, so yeah, a very involved project, not just writing the songs and singing.
Yeah, it was a journey. In a way, it was nice to have this songwriting process, take place over a period of 8 years, because it meant that I had that part kind of already finished by the time I got to the production process, so I could give myself more fully to that.
Do you think it's a little easier to put things out in this musical format than to just put your ideas and your experiences straight out there on paper like you're attempting to with the book? Is that, I sense some more resistance with the book.
Absolutely. Yeah, the album itself, it freaks me out enough just because these songs are so intimate. More than any other song, You All Pursue actually scared me the most, because I wrote that song around the time of my reckoning day. I was actually sitting in a church service and just not connecting to anything that was going on. And I didn't really know what to do about that, because that wasn't in my sort of like life plan, to just like suddenly feel like I was like spiritually off the map and like disconnected from everything I kind of like thrown my life on. So that song, in a way, like it felt kind of like sacrilegious to write when I first wrote it, especially the bridge. And so that was definitely one that I sat on for a number of years. But I think putting it in the middle of the album, like sort of being able to pad it with other songs, it helped a little bit. And just being able to like encapsulate this as a whole story, where it's like these are all different like snapshots at different times. Like even like Fields of Green like shows up later on the album, and like it's in a way, it's like kind of a gospel song. It's like bluegrass gospel and I wrote it like pretty recently, right? And so, about like, again, sort of finding a way to have peace, even when something doesn't, isn't going your way. And so, I don't know, just being able to make the statement that like there is no one thing that you can say to sort of encapsulate this whole like journey through a crisis of faith. And so being able to put it in context of all these other songs made it go down a little easier, especially like opening the album with like Foot from Gold, which is just kind of like a fun song about like going after your dreams. But certainly once you get to putting it down on paper in terms of just words, I mean, I experienced that even with, I sort of experimented with my own podcast earlier this year, just talking about some of the stories that were behind the inspiration for the album, like interviewing different people about their own journeys through a crisis of faith or how they saw that. And it's not like it had like it wasn't like people were arguing online, which is like the thing I think I'm most afraid of at all times. But it was just that it's such like awkward conversations to like put out there, that I think music is a vehicle that just allows us to enter like a higher plane where it's not just like words on a page or even like talking with each other, but we have like, it's almost this other spiritual element. Or even, I don't know, I was thinking of this C.S. Lewis quote, like fiction sneaks past the watchful dragons of religion. And that's why I think I love storytelling. Or there's a Tom Stoppard quote who said something like, yeah, the reason I write fiction is because I'm too lazy to actually come up with my own opinions. So I just tell a story and I can hide behind my characters.
It sounds like he's hiding behind that quote, though, because certainly his opinions are better in this place.
Yeah, they are. But just like being able to encapsulate that as different characters, because I think very rarely is, the answer to all of this just like one singular answer. And even to get there, you have to hear all these different perspectives and people at different stages of their journey. So music helps towards that end. But yeah, who knows? We're talking right now on a podcast, which is, a step for me. I don't spend a lot of time, talking publicly about like dealing with the crisis of faith. So we'll see where it goes. I'm excited about being able to put it out there. It's gotten a really good response so far.
I enjoyed your podcast a lot too. I listened to several episodes. Yeah.
Thank you. Someone just told me the other day that they were listening to my podcast, and I legitimately had totally forgotten about it. Like I was literally, she was telling me like, yeah, it's a project you worked on this year, and I was like, was it my book? Was it my Funk Folk YouTube channel? Like I forgot entirely that I had made that podcast. It just goes to show, I guess, how much the music just like snowballed over everything else. And so I might put more episodes out there. I mean, I'm sitting on a lot of interviews, which provided some like direct inspiration for songs in the album, especially Here's to the Sojourners. I was just chatting with one of the guys who was the inspiration for the line that talks about, rent overdue or a boy with a tumor, you're stuck on these promises never come true. I mean, he was in this ICU ward praying for this 4-year-old boy, and him and his friend were going in there like every day, and they basically had full faith that this boy was going to get better. I mean, he was all hooked up to tubes, and and then he ended up passing away. And that he went through that, and then there was another woman that similar experience. It's just like when you experience enough of those, I mean, some people from those days, I mean, they've legitimately been diagnosed with PTSD from those days. I mean, some of my friends, they literally saw about 40 people pass away during their time there. And that really does something to someone. And so I just wanted to sort of honor those journeys of those people and hopefully help them find a way to heal and move forward.
Remind me of the title of your podcast. Was it Sojourner Stories?
Yeah, Sojourner Stories. Yeah, so I guess in a way I've been intending to create a product suite. I don't really think of it as products because it's not like you really can buy the podcast. Or I mean, I guess you can go on Bandcamp and buy the album, but like it's more just like these all sort of interlink with each other. And if the book, if that comes to fruition, yeah. Then that'll fit right in with the rest of it. The podcast is Sojourner Stories, and it can be found on, everywhere you can find podcasts. I only have 4 episodes up so far, but who knows, if I can find the time and if people want to hear more of those stories, I'm happy to keep putting them out.
You mentioned the term crisis of faith a few times. And I was thinking
Yeah.
some people might think, well, how is changing beliefs a crisis? They think of, well, a crisis is losing your job or a
Yeah.
parent or loved one dying. So how is it that changing beliefs can feel like a crisis or be an actual crisis?
Well, it's funny because the term crisis of faith being applied to, I guess, what I went through was kind of a new revelation that was introduced to me by a gentleman named Brian Elaine, who runs Writing for Your Life. It's essentially resources for spiritual writers. And in some ways, like, this is just my personal opinion, but like using the terminology of like crisis of faith versus deconstruction almost has less to do with the experience itself and more to do with like where you end up. Because I feel like if you're like, okay, I don't want anything, like let's say you're an evangelical Christian and then you decide like, okay, I don't want anything to do with that Christianity anymore, then you would probably call that experience a deconstruction. You become, an agnostic or a Buddhist or an atheist or whatever. But a crisis of faith, I think, more implies that you still retain elements of what you had before. It's more that you pick out those things that don't work for you, you leave those behind, and you take those elements that are still good and still work for you. And for me, one of the most difficult parts of navigating this is that I didn't fully decide, well, I hate everything about God or the church or Christians or anything. Like I didn't think that. If it was that simple, then this would have been a lot quicker of a process. But it was like parsing through, okay, like what parts of this do I not like versus what do I like? Is it like the communal aspect, or for example, going to church every Sunday. I liked that, or the music, or like being able to sort of feel that peace when you're with other people and worshiping together, or just sort of like that humility and just sort of even that just desire to make the world a better place, which I felt like sometimes in the other communities I became a part of, like they just didn't really care about anything, and they just were kind of like, well, it's just like drink and do whatever, and it was just like, that wasn't appealing to me either. So for me, I guess I have tried to piece together the parts of faith that I wanted and sort of leave behind those that don't. And one of the things we did to try to encapsulate this process was by the artwork that went on the album. So if you look at the cover of it, it's the ship, which for anyone who knows me, I'm just like obsessed with ships, and there's no logical reason to it other than I grew up in like a landlocked province in Canada, and my parents gave me a Lego pirate ship when I was 5. So but there was a quote that helped me a lot during the early stages of my deconstruction crisis of faith by G.E. Lessing, who was an 18th century writer who wrote, "They make glorious shipwreck who are lost in seeking worlds." And it might just be the nautical theme that I really liked, but something about that sort of encapsulated or gave some meaning to this process instead of just me sort of falling apart internally for no reason. And so the cover of the album is this ship that has its sails patchwork together. It's been through a storm, but it has found a way to move forward. And it's really difficult to see if you just look at the artwork on like on a CD cover or on Spotify. But if you can zoom in close enough and it's not blurry, you'll actually see the seams that connect the patchwork together are actually made out of lyrics to the songs on the album.
What?
And so in a way, it's saying that, art can help us glue these pieces of our lives together. And behind the ship, if you flip to like the back cover, or if you see the full painting, I kind of wish I was back in my studio because I would show you the full painting. There's actually leftovers, refuse in the water behind the ship. So there's like a barrel, there's like crates and like an old tattered like sail. And that's sort of representing this journey of like, okay, you're still on the same journey. And for me, it was like really important to not just like decide, okay, my entire life journey was a waste. Like it was, for me personally, it was just like kind of important for me to be able to see this not as like, okay, like that was all just like sunk cost, whatever, it's gone, but instead saying, no, actually, I think like everything I've been through is part of the same journey. Because there's certain things I still, do try to cling to, and being able to retain that through this whole process has been important. So it's still the same ship. Some parts have changed. There's that whole to keep going with the ship theme. There's that ship of Theseus like question. I don't know if you're familiar with, right? It's like the ship gets rebuilt over say a period of 100 years, and by the time it's rebuilt, it has totally new material. So the sort of philosophical question is like, is that still the ship of Theseus, or is it a different ship altogether? And so for me, I mean, I guess how I link that to my life is like, there are still some elements that I retain from that faith. I mean, even like I helped lead worship at a church yesterday. And so it's this strange, I mean, it's a very different church than, I was going to 10 years ago, but it's still this, I don't know, it's a conundrum, but at the same time, I think just like being able to be honest about it helps you move forward. And even if it's just to recognize those differing beliefs you have, and how they might fit together or not fit together. The contradictions, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Yeah, the contradictions in your life.
When I was going through the transition of a literal understanding of faith in the Bible and Christian doctrine, the process that took several years of switching over to seeing these things as metaphors and symbols, there was a constant burning sensation in my mind. I felt like as I was always reading and thinking, trying to sort these things through, and it created this heat in my brain, is how I would describe it. And eventually that was relieved. But can you identify with that just feeling of your mind burning?
Oh, absolutely. Because especially if you're sort of trained with this idea, like that you've got a corner on the market of truth, and outside of your circle or bubble, there is no truth. I mean, like, it's weird thinking like growing up, I actually remember being surprised to learn that most people in the world were not Mennonites, because I grew up Mennonite. My parents like that's how small of a town I grew up in. I was like, wait, like we're not the majority of the world. Like, who wouldn't want to be a Mennonite? And I'm like, oh, it's actually like even within Christianity, it's like this tiny little like fragment of the population. So when you are raised with that sort of idea that like your truth at the expense of all other truths, in a way, like the sort of DNA of that can continue even if you sort of let go of those initial beliefs or parts of those initial beliefs. And so you keep on being like, okay, well, I have to find the truth then, like the one truth at the expense of all other truths. It's because it's trying to think on like a whole different level to get beyond that, and to actually be okay with saying like, you know what, I don't know. I actually don't know a lot of stuff, and like actually having peace with like, I actually might not need to know, and I'm not going to know. And certainly I think, having my reckoning day experience was one thing that helped me, I think, first realize that maybe it was okay. But at the same time, I think maybe it wasn't even until like the pandemic that I really had time to do all the research and really dive into all these questions about what is supernatural healing? Is it actually supernatural? Is it all like just science and psychology? Like all of these questions, like where I gave myself the time to research that, where I don't know, I came to peace, I think, with a lot of these things for myself. And in a way, I think it kind of relieved the burning in me to have it all to have it all figured out.
Yeah, I don't know if I could help someone else through that process or describe the steps, but there was a point where then that burning stopped and I was more at peace with not knowing all the answers. It just takes time to get to that point.
Yeah, it does. And then, but then I think, and then on the flip side, it's difficult because there are times when you do need to still make decisions. You need to have some sort of core beliefs that allow you to decide, do I want to move to Los Angeles or to Philadelphia? Do I want to marry this person? It's like, it's fun to be spineless or whatever until like, reality hits.
Yeah.
So you do in a sense have to come up with some sort of structure that at least allows you to like function as a human being. So it's certainly a balance.
Yeah. But I'd say this theological faith struggle was something even separate from life. It's something that's been overlaid on top of our life decisions, like, where to live, who to marry, like you're saying, and a lot of unnecessary struggle is added to that.
Yeah, it's certainly true. Although I would say, like, because of my particular Bible school experience, which was really based on experiential instead of sort of theoretical knowledge, we were taught very sort of clearly how to hear the voice of God as it pertains to making life decisions. And I had enough experiences in my life where what I had interpreted as the voice of God really turned out to not be what I thought it was. Like, I mean, I'll give just like a really silly example. So there was this time I was in South Africa on this missions trip, And I had basically misread my itinerary for my flight. And I like, turned out the flight actually left an hour earlier than I thought. So I was like, oh my gosh, we got to go. But I just had this peace the whole time that like, all right, well, God's got me, like, I'm going to make the flight anyway. So the flight was going from Durban to Johannesburg, and then the flight I really needed to make was Johannesburg to Paris, right, to get back to the States. And I remember I missed my flight from Durban to Joburg, but I managed to hop on the next flight, and I think this new flight left like, I don't know, something like half an hour layover time for me to like cross the Joburg airport one side or the other to get on this Paris flight. But it just felt like, oh yeah, I got this piece, like it's gonna be good. And so I like I was like a relay racer. When the gate opened, I just like booked it across. They tried to get in to the Paris flight. But this whole time having this piece, like, yeah, I'm going to make the flight. I'm going to make the flight, you know? And a long story short, I ended up getting like swindled out of like hundreds of dollars from a guy who like pretended to work for the airport, and ended up missing the flight and having to sleep overnight in the Christian prayer room and getting like woken up by a bunch of security officers in the middle of the night. It was just this like crazy, like worst case scenario situation. And I had to grapple with like, okay, like I thought I very clearly heard what God was going to do. And then just like very clearly having that like tacit knowledge, that like bruising experience that like proved that wrong. And when you sort of stack enough of those, you sort of realize like, okay, I have to change what I think or how I make decisions or those sorts of things. But that's why I would say, like, for me at least, this reconstruction of beliefs, it affected kind of every part of my life, whether it's like, you know, making decisions, you know, understanding like the peace and the voice of God, or how I think about like personal health, or how I think about, you know, marriage and relationships. Like it's all of these things that sort of impact in different ways. So.
Now, I've heard some people say when they missed the plane, they would say, "Well, that plane was going to crash, so God saved me."
That's true. Yeah. So you can continue to
Keep it going.
yeah, and it's true. Like it wasn't even, that would happen in 2011. So it was not necessarily that experience alone that like caused me to think differently. And you know, honestly, like I probably could have gone through a lifetime of those experiences and not really changed my mind about anything, because the more I've studied like how the mind works, I realized like our minds are really not geared to pay attention to facts. We're much more inclined to want to stay in our social circles because we're tribal, right? And so I think what really caused me to start thinking differently was being invited into a different tribe in the university I went to, in the theater program, where I got to hang out with people who maybe I didn't have a similar faith to, but I could talk about movies and music and theater, and there were people that liked Les Mis and all these shows like I'd never heard of. And so it was, in a way, it was actually finding that common ground that really caused the crisis of faith, because then it was like, well, what are my beliefs based on? Is it just because I was trying to fit in? And so that's again why I spend very little time trying to like convince people to think differently, because at least in my own experience, like the things that have caused me to change were, I mean, number one, like, you know, bruising experience on my own part, but number two, even bigger, was being sort of invited into something different from other people who thought differently.
A lot of this kind of magical thinking of Christians didn't bother me too much, or I thought, I can see how this can be a good thing for them personally, helping carry them through crises. Up until 2016, when Trump was elected, and so many started saying, "No, Trump is the chosen one.
Right.
God told me that Trump is His man."
Right.
That's when I really began to think of it as a dangerous thing.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, there just come a time where you realize maybe I should speak up and do something.
Yeah.
Because yeah, it's true. I mean, our beliefs do have real world implications. And you know, that concept of like, well, I'm gonna believe what's true regardless of fact. I mean, it's funny because in a way, the sort of rise of Trumpism was very much tied into the churches I used to go to. So they were some of the biggest proponents of Trump. And so certainly experiencing that, I mean, it's like, it's weird because like everybody, no matter what their beliefs are, just decided like based on sort of that election that they were just going to get more extreme in those beliefs. It's like no matter what you were, you know, it's like you just go one way or the other. But I mean, for me, I guess the way that in a way it's weird, but the motivation for this album in a way does go a little, even a step deeper than like helping people through a crisis of faith. Because what really got my gears grinding on thinking about this stuff was climate change. I actually knew very little about climate change other than like the average person who's like, yeah, we should like be nice to the world and stuff. It's like no one disagrees with that. But I think I listened to an podcast episode of, I think back then it was called Ask Science Mike. And I think the episode was called How Screwed Are We? Essentially, it was a special report from the UN about how serious climate change actually is. And basically they were like, well, we've got about 10 years to really get our act together. And if we don't, like, we're probably going to screw over like every future generation of humans. And that was such a, like, I think there was no clearer call to action for me than like seeing this juxtaposition of, okay, I was going out to try to like heal the world and set people free and things like that, 10 years ago. And here now it's like weird because it's like we all sort of in a way still might have that responsibility. And it was especially weird to be like, yeah, actually some of the biggest like either climate change deniers or people who, just don't pay any attention to it are actually like white evangelical Christians. And so knowing like I certainly have had my experiences with those communities, and still have some links and stuff, got me wondering like, well, what can I do? I mean, even getting more personally about like what kind of lifestyle changes do I have to make? Because obviously with climate change, no one person is going to make the difference. It's like literally the only way we have any hope of doing anything is like huge, more than World War II level mobilization type changes, like drastically faster than anything we've ever done before. So yeah, that actually led to me writing 4 different songs about climate change, where I tried to encapsulate, I guess kind of like a call to action, or like trying to like get us to sort of pay attention to like this serious thing that was happening. And it's funny because like the final song on Here's to the Sojourners was initially going to be a song called For Such a Time as This. That was kind of a climate change anthem, like a call to action about like, loving the way Jesus did. And so like that should cause us to like do something about climate change. And I mean, if people want to hear it, it's on my YouTube channel. I think I posted it like a year ago, but I got enough feedback from people, and it was just like people who come from a lot of different backgrounds, who basically were like, yeah, I don't know if that song's going to do it. Like, I started realizing like, because climate change is such a huge topic, like, I don't think it can be encapsulated in a song. And you can't just like point the blame at like one people group and be like, well, you're the problem, because it's like, we're all the problem. Like not everybody, like not everybody, but like me personally, I'm still the problem. Like, the way that we have lived since the, industrial revolution, especially, it's like our whole lifestyle. So it's like, I can't just publish a song, like wash my hands. Like it's so like far ranging and still something that I'm, grappling with, that I, ultimately decided to not have the climate change song on the album. But I thought at least opening up the conversation about struggling through crisis of faith, maybe that could be a step towards a conversation about climate change. Because I think a thing that a lot of people don't understand is that our beliefs are all interrelated. Like you can't just decide well, I'm going to convince them about climate change. Because like they've done studies and found like someone's opinions on climate change are actually like, if you can figure out what their opinions are on climate change, you can pretty much figure out what their opinions are on gun control. Not on everybody, but it's like we have sets of beliefs. It's not just like one belief that's independent of another. And so for me, at least, like acknowledging like my own journey and my own crisis of faith and talking about that, like maybe it can lead to some, I don't know, finding common ground with people, and at least asking like, hey, like, we all still want to like do good in the world. We want things better for our kids and for the world. Like no one disagrees with that. Like, is there a way we can like do this together, like regardless of some of the other things? So maybe that's another step for the project. But I will say one thing that I just realized recently that helped me with that was I actually got to music direct a theater show. It was the first show I got to music direct since COVID. It's a show called Soon, which is written by Nick Blameyer, who's a New York writer, and the whole musical is actually about climate change. Essentially, I mean, it's this girl, 20-somethings, in New York, basically grappling with the fact that the world is like about to burn up and it's going to end pretty soon, and she's like, well, what do I do? And so being part of that project and seeing like, yeah, I mean, if you're going to tackle something like climate change, it really does have to be like a large kind of like story with an arc to it. Cause I mean, kind of like a crisis of faith, there's so many different like aspects to that. So at least getting to work on that project felt kind of meaningful for me.
Yeah, I can see even within Christianity, or from a religious perspective, there are 2 possible approaches. One would be humans are meant to be stewards of the earth and the environment.
Yes.
The other approach would be, well, God is in control, so there's nothing humans can do to affect the climate anyway. If he's turning up the temperature,
Yeah.
that just means that these are the end times. He's about to wrap it up.
Yeah, exactly. And so I figure, like I still retain the beliefs that we should be good stewards of the earth, but different people call it by
Mhm.
different things. But I think if we can focus on the things that we have in common, like that's probably how we're going to get forward in today's world.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Otherwise, we'll just have like civil war and chaos and end of the world kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's really scary when people who believe in the end times and the literal book of Revelation, when they have political power,
Right.
the more turmoil in the Middle East, the better, because that means Jesus is coming back soon.
Yeah, exactly. When you sort of have this like hands-off approach to reality where you have no say in what happens and it's all God's will, which, in a way I've always, I don't know, like, I don't think any Christian believes in that like wholeheartedly at the exclusion of everything else, though, because we all have some agency. We can choose to like put on a seatbelt when we go in a car or not. Like, yeah, when you dive into some of those questions and you take it like too far, it gets into a very weird place. And so I don't know. There's some questions you can live or die on, and like, figuring out the will of God versus not the will of God. I'm just like, boy, then we'll leave that to the Calvinists and Armenians. They can argue amongst themselves.
Yeah. With the seatbelt example, the first thing that comes to my mind is the COVID vaccine.
Yeah, I know, and that's like an ongoing thing I'm thinking about constantly, because I do, the nature of where I live is like my life still is at the intersection of people who believe a lot of different stuff, family, friends, and I try to maintain a connection with everyone as much as I can, and sort of like try to listen to people and give them the benefit of the doubt. But certainly with COVID vaccines, like the whole concept of like, well, let everyone kind of do what they want, and masks or not masks, it's like doesn't feel very applicable to me, because again, we're talking about like a big systemic thing that your individual choices really do affect some pretty massive stuff. So I think about that all the time, and it's admittedly super difficult, especially for a nice Canadian Mennonite who wants to just like stay out of arguments.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of the parable of there's a flood and a rabbi is on the roof of his house praying for God to save him.
Yeah.
A boat comes by and they say, hop in. And he says, nope, I'm praying to God. He's going to save me. And
It's so true. I mean, and yeah, I can relate to that so well. Like, I mean, even I mentioned earlier a little bit like about marriage and relationships and things like that, because I think for the longest time I was taught, and I think we've actually talked about this before, when we got to hang out in Nashville the other year, but about like there's a teaching that's prevalent in a lot of churches, and I guess I kind of gleaned from the school I went to, that's like, okay, you're just gonna like meet the one, and like you're gonna know. And so I spent like a lot of years just basically like passing up a lot of good opportunities to date, and just experience that like any normal like 20 something would. But now that I've like pulled back and I'm in my 30s and being like, yeah, why did I think that? Like, there were plenty of opportunities along the way if I just like take initiative and sort of like be willing to learn, and experiment with dating and things like that. Who knows what could have happened. It's like you have to take action at some level. There is an element of like being able to rest in the midst of that, which is what songs like "Come Your Child" and "Field of Green" are like on my album. But the other then there's the other spectrum, which you get foot from gold, right? Like, I'm gonna go after this goal, and I don't care if everyone thinks I'm stupid or crazy. Like, I'm going to just keep going after it regardless.
it's great. So, with crisis of faith, climate change, these heavy topics, what's the area that gives you the most hope right now?
Oh man. I mean, I'm not giving a long pause because I think, because I'm like, oh, there is no hope. Like, in some ways, I found a lot of hope in, this is going to sound cheesy, but in simply trusting the process, because it's so easy in the middle of a situation to think, my gosh, this is never going to end. I remember like I had this nightmare scenario. It's not actually a nightmare scenario, but it's like trying to track down a bass player for my album, and like someone canceled on me, and it was like a couple of weeks away from it. It was just like I remember like sitting in like the parking lot of like a Giant and being like, my gosh, I can't stand this anymore. Why is this so hard? and then like looking back at all those different steps along the way where like recording equipment wasn't working or like all these different stuff, and realizing like, wow, like we still finished this album. Like it still came out, it happened, it's everywhere. It's something that once was just like an idea that I used to like play in my studio by myself and cry and stare at a wall, and like was a very private thing. And now all these different people are listening to these songs, and um, just having hope that I guess our feelings don't have to dictate our reality, that even regardless of how we might feel right now, that doesn't necessarily tell us where our future is headed. And that's actually something I was reading through your meditations this morning by Epictetus, and like that's so much about that, like focusing on the things that you can control. And that's been so important for me. So I don't know, that's kind of a roundabout answer, but like I've found a lot of hope in just seeing that, yes, even if it doesn't feel like this hard work is going to pay off, you know, it's very easy to get in the mindset of like, well, it happens to everybody else, but it's not going to happen to me. But just like trusting in that, you know, good things do happen. You don't have to focus on the bad things, because sometimes they do. And I there's almost so many good things happening right now to me in my personal life and professional, that like I'm almost numb to it. It's weird. It's like, am I really like, I was just given a grant from the Small Business Administration, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm just like, wow. And so I guess it's like hopefully giving me some like gas in the tank for the future, where I might feel like I'm in the middle of like the mire of another project that I feel like I'm never going to finish, and it's just going to continue to snowball and cost and time, and I'm never going to get it done. So that's been helpful. But I guess now that I think about it, another thing that gives me hope is actually that the people that I wrote this album for have given me a really, really beautiful response so far. I've heard from almost everybody from my time in California and San Jose, and you know, that inspired the album, and they've all in different ways expressed support, and some said it's really helped them process those things and times, and that's been very meaningful to me, because really what started, if I could like encapsulate one moment that actually began this whole project, it was a voice memo that I found a couple of years ago when I was just sifting through my computer. It was actually the final prayer that was given to me by the pastor of the church that ran the supernatural school of ministry I was going to. And his final words, which I had just like recorded on my phone, were, I pray they would remember this day 10, 15, 20 years from now, God, how you sent them out to make a difference in the world. And a lot of this in a way has just been kind of a response to that, because I released the first version of Here's to the Sojourners on my Instagram channel on the 10-year anniversary of that prayer. And to me, I still want to make a difference in the world. That's still what I want to do. And so finding these ways to tie the past into the present, I think, is a way of helping us heal and move forward and hopefully make a difference in new and different ways.
It's great. So trust the process. And if you're despairing today, remember that that's just today. You're not going to feel that way forever.
Yeah. Linking those things together. I agree. Yep.
And that we each make a difference in our own way.
Yeah. And even if it means, I don't know, like, even if making a difference for me looks very different, you know, I'm obviously like not running around in the streets, like laying hands on everybody who I see who's like in a wheelchair, but like really even just making a difference for people who suffered trauma for those ministry days. If I can still make a difference in those lives, then in a way I still feel like I've accomplished my purpose. So I'm grateful for that, even though it's very much not what I expected, but you know, I think most of us can relate to that.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for taking time to talk. It's been great.
Yeah, it's been great, Sam. I've really appreciated your support and your own books also, because you are an excellent writer, and the fact that you have put all these words in print and allowed me to read them, that's been really great to be like, oh, I'm friends with somebody who actually publishes books that I really like to read.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.